Iran's Kharg Island is the ultimate bargaining chip. Sitting 25 kilometers off the Iranian coast, the island is known for its historical monastery and temples, its incredible archaeological finds, and oil refinery that just happens to handle up to 90% of all Iranian oil exports. For Iran, its allies, and especially its adversaries, the value of Kharg Island is obvious. Control the island and you could throttle Iran's oil-dependent economy, capture the island intact, and another nation could make Iran do anything to get it back. Destroy it outright, and Iran would transform from a powerful rogue nation into an economic afterthought, and that's if we're being generous. As the United States and Israel wage war against Iran, it should be no surprise that Kharg Island has become an object of fixation for US President Donald Trump, a world leader with the military power to seize the island and bring Iran to its knees. Right now, thousands of US Marines and Army paratroopers are inbound to the Middle East, and there's a strong possibility that Kharg Island is their ultimate target. But as Uncle Sam directs his hungry gaze toward the crown jewel of the Iranian economy, America and its allies would do well to remember it's a lot harder to take Kharg Island in real life than it was in the Battlefield 3 or the Delta Force games. In fact, if the United States intends to take Kharg Island using only the forces traveling to the Middle East today, then there's a real chance that the island could be the place that America endures its worst military defeat in generations. Just a quick note before we continue. I recently got a book sent to me that is honestly one of the coolest apocalypse-themed things that I've seen in a while. It's a very specific thing, isn't it? Honestly, it's just one of the coolest books that I've seen in a while. It's called The 4 Illustrated Survival Guide, and it is not your typical survival book. Instead of just being a wall of text, the entire thing is packed with hand-drawn artwork and cinematic illustration. You pick it up, open it at any page. What's this? It's all about the crossbow. Look, every page is like this, just beautifully illustrated with diagrams, and this is about multivitamin plants. Excellent. We'll go deep, close path. What about this one? Otzi's pack frame. Oh, wait, I know this. This is very cool. Campfires, everything difficulty level, easy. It basically walks through 4 different apocalypse scenarios: a pandemic, a zombie outbreak, nuclear winter, and global warming, each chapter feeling like its own world with a different artist and writer. It's part survival guide, part artwork, part dystopian storytelling. It actually all started on Kickstarter and raised over $600,000, and that makes sense because it's really, really beautiful. I've had this sitting on, not my desk alone, it's too big to fit on my desk, it's a little shelf, and it's big enough, so I have it open like this, the other shelf's up there, and I'll just have it open, and I'll just open it to a page and have a quick read. It's like a coffee table book at my office. That's because I don't have a coffee table. Look, if you want to check it out, I'll leave a link in the description below. Look, you can grab the Illustrated Survival Guide. It's in the link in the description. And if you use the code WARFRONTS4book for the promotion, you'll get a special discount. If you're into survival stuff, it's definitely worth taking a look. And now back to today's video. The target. Now, before we can understand what it means to attack Kharg Island, we have to start by discussing Kharg Island itself. Despite the world's intense focus on the Strait of Hormuz, Kharg Island is located in the northern Persian Gulf, much closer to the Gulf's Iraqi shoreline than the Indian Ocean. While it's a mere 25 kilometers from the closest point on the Iranian coastline, Kharg Island is around 60 kilometers from the city of Bushehr, the site of Iran's sole nuclear power plant and the country's most important commercial port. Just 180 kilometers from Bushehr is the major city of Shiraz, home to about 1.6 million people, a major refinery, and the economic center that southern Iran relies on. What that means, the practical sense, is that the export facilities on Kharg Island are the most important site in one of Iran's most important regions, meaning that the region is especially important to the Iranian military. This is a region with a well-developed civilian infrastructure, a large presence from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and most likely the hidden weapons stockpiles match. Then there's the island itself, a low-lying coral outcrop with an elevation of just 70 meters at its highest point. With a land area of roughly 20 square kilometers, Kharg Island is basically flat, basically triangular in shape and surrounded by deep waters to enable the transit of oil tankers. The island is not home to any substantial vegetation or other territorial obstructions, except for relative high ground near its southern edge. It does, however, have its own supply of fresh water. The island's coastline is mostly sandy and gradually sloped, making it an ideal candidate for an amphibious landing. While the island is located near several offshore oil fields, it is not the site of any onshore oil production. Instead, the island is host to the major oil terminal we mentioned earlier, a sprawling facility that takes up the majority of the island's land area. That's mostly because of the island's topography. warded off most of the Iranian coast to shallow and rocky. From Iran's vantage point, it was easier to just route the vast majority of oil exports to Karg Island and try and construct new deep-water ports off the mainland. To give you an idea of the size of the operations on the island, the landmass hosts Karg City, a restricted access area that home to roughly 8,200 long-term or semi-permanent residents. Receives oil transfers from the Iranian mainland through a network of submarine pipelines, and it's also fed through pipelines running directly to Karg from a trio of offshore oil fields, bypassing the Iranian coast entirely. Once crude oil reaches the island's storage space, it can accommodate up to 28 million barrels at a given time. That crude oil is then refined on-site before being transferred to the export terminal, where Iran boasts the capacity to host and load 10 trillion supertankers. Operating at full capacity, Karg Islands can export up to 1.6 million barrels of oil each day. Of course, the people in charge of Karg Island are well aware that Iran is currently at the heart of a major regional conflict, and as such, the island is not the same today as it was prior to the start of the war. Across late 2025 and early 2026, Iran offloaded oil from Karg Islands much faster than the terminal accepted new shipments, with a very high proportion of that oil travelling toward China. As of now, exports from Karg Island have slowed down dramatically, although Iranian ships are still able to transit the Strait of Hormuz and have been left alone by US and other foreign Navy vessels. While the island did host a substantial military presence prior to the war, including forces based at Karg Island and its 1,800-metre runway, those forces took a beating from the United States Air Force on the 13th of March. On that day, US Central Command claimed that it had targeted over 90 Iranian military sites across the islands, although according to both Iran and the US, the island's oil infrastructure was spared. The US indicated that it destroyed, quote, naval mine storage facilities, missile storage bunkers, and multiple other military sites. US President Donald Trump claimed that the military forces based on the island were, quote, totally obliterated. As of the time of writing, the extent of the surviving military infrastructure on Karg Island is unknown, assuming any infrastructure has survived at all. Satellite imagery obtained after the strike reveals that exports are still ongoing, while blast damage is visible at several locations. And there's one final question to ask about the island itself, although by now we suspect that the answer might be obvious. Why would the United States want to capture it? And in a word, of course, it's leverage. By seizing control of Karg Island, the US would be able to use it as a bargaining chip to essentially hold the Iranian economy hostage. The US could control the docking and loading of oil tankers, it could shut down the island's refinery, it could obstruct or cut off access to pipelines, and it could even threaten to destroy the facility itself unless Iran complies with American demands. According to recent reports by Axios citing multiple well-placed US officials, the island is among the prime candidates for what American planners are calling a, quote, final blow to end the conflict. While the US is purportedly considering attacks against other islands near the Strait of Hormuz, or a blockade or the seizure of Iranian ships leaving the strait, the capture of Karg Island would deliver unparalleled leverage for Washington. According to those Axios sources, Washington's intent is to launch an operation so decisive that Iran would have no choice but to negotiate. And if the United States believe that such an operation is feasible, then Karg Island is the obvious first choice. The defenses. Unfortunately for America's top military minds, there's a well-worn expression about military operations like these: no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Originally, that quote is attributed to 19th century Prussian General Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, which, by the way, is a very appropriate name for a 19th century Prussian general. But much like the conflicts of Moltke's time, the conflicts of the modern day have a tendency to get very messy very quickly, especially when a powerful attacking force goes into a complex, risky ground operation, believing that it's already secured the upper hand. Now, before we get into any of the details on an Iranian defense of Karg Island, we've got to make one thing clear. For America to actually secure this island and turn it into a strategic bargaining chip, it's going to have to do more than simply raising the red, white, and blue over the central refinery. In the event that the United States did attempt to seize Karg Island, they would face resistance in actually reaching the island and attempting to capture it. We'll talk about the finer points of that resistance in just a moment, but the bulk of Iran's defense of Karg Island won't actually involve stopping America from taking the territory. Instead, Iran's defense of the island will only truly begin once the island has already been seized. Iran will be guided by the same tactical and strategic rationale that it's relied upon across the rest of this conflict, that by using missiles, drones, and any other munitions that can reach a given target, Iran's goal is to impose costs. Iran doesn't care about winning head-to-head battles, and in fact it would rather avoid those battles entirely because it understands that its adversaries, especially the United States, are far less willing to accept losses or damage than Iran itself. itself. But before we get into any detailed discussion of what that looks like, we'll start with the resistance Iran would offer against a seizure operation by the United States. That defense will start at relatively long range, where Iran will deploy anti-ship cruise missiles, aerial kamikaze drones, and even more dangerous sea drones to try and hit any ships approaching by sea. The extent of Iran's surviving weapons stockpiles is unknown, but judging by Iran's ability to continue to strike targets across the Middle East at long range, Tehran clearly hasn't run out of those weapons completely. Iran will also employ static defenses, specifically sea mines, that it can deploy on just hours' notice before an American landing force arrives. The forces that the US or any nation would need to amass on the water for an operation like this are very substantial. Iran will see them coming before they arrive, especially with the benefit of intelligence supplied by Russia and China, as currently seems to be the case. Forces coming in from the air, like paratroopers or close air support, are another story. Iran lacks the ability to meaningfully contest control of the skies, and while low-flying aircraft will be at greater risk of attack from shoulder-fired missiles and other weaponry Iran may have at its disposal, the US will be able to partially offset that risk through airstrikes, operating its own real-time intelligence to hit Iranian defenses. Iran's concentration of ground forces on Karg Island is currently unknown, both because Iran wasn't really in the mood to give out that sort of information even before America's airstrikes, and because after the airstrikes it's not clear how many Iranian soldiers or how much of their fighting equipment would have survived. Most likely, any heavy equipment that was stationed on the island will no longer be available, and the specific US claim on destroyed Iranian targets, over 90 of them to be precise, would suggest that the US may have been able to target decentralized hidden supply caches across the island. Some of Iran's hidden supplies will most likely have survived, meaning that soldiers, paramilitaries, and possibly even island inhabitants who are willing to fight back could all participate in an organized resistance to a US landing. According to a recent CNN report, Iran is also working to beef up its island defenses in the wake of US airstrikes on March the 13th. Iran is working to lay anti-armor and anti-personnel mines, including on the island shores, while reinforcing what appears to be a layered air defense system to protect Karg against attacks from above. Without any doubt, any amphibious or parachute landing on the island will be preceded by intense aerial bombardment. The trouble with bombardments, however, is that aircraft inevitably miss things, while surveillance fails to pick up on defenses or weapon stockpiles that have been well hidden. There's no telling what the US will destroy and what it'll fail to pick up on, but some of those mines and air defenses will survive, raising the possibility that they could claim the lives of US troops or shoot down vulnerable, non-stealthy, low-flying aircraft. That said, Karg will not be an easy place to defend once US ground forces have established a foothold. Iranians on the island will either be left exposed or be forced to use refinery infrastructure as cover unless they allow themselves to be pushed into the island town where most residents live. It's after the United States takes control and radios back news of their victory to Washington that the real trouble for US troops may begin. Of course, we should emphasize there's a chance that Tehran will do what the United States seems to believe it will: see America's control of the island and immediately call for ceasefire negotiations. But Iran's actions to this point in the conflict reveal a very different modus operandi. Iran's objective is not victory in any conventional sense. Tehran is able to accept the deaths of its political and military leaders and the destruction of its cities, and mass casualties among its soldiers, paramilitaries, and civilian supporters. Iran's focus is on regime survival, not the survival of the people who make up the regime, but the survival of the regime itself. To be clear, if the US were to capture and hold Karg Island for the long term, Iran would face complete economic ruin. But if the United States is going to impose that ruin on Iran, then it will need weeks or even months in order to do so. During this conflict, Iran's strategic understanding of the United States has been consistent and unnervingly accurate. The American public is not willing to accept the loss of American troops, and it is not willing to accept long-term or severe economic pain just to see the Islamic Republic overthrown. Regardless of what the Trump administration may want, the American public, the American markets, and a large share of Trump's own voting base just don't value this war very much. For Iran, however, the war is everything. And as of the time of writing, Iran has consistently made the bet that it can force the United States and its allies to blink first. If that's how Iran responds to the capture of Karg Island, then America's initial takeover will be the easy part. The first problem that the US would have to account for is the Iranian ground forces, a combination of roughly 350,000 soldiers in the Iranian army, about 150,000 soldiers across the ground forces of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and another several hundred thousand paramilitary fighters of the Besieged Resistance Force. Those ground forces have been mostly left out of the current conflict, unless they're getting bombed from above or they're launching missiles and drones, and they are beyond ready to get into the fight after a very frustrating few weeks on the sidelines. It's going to be difficult for those forces to reach Karg Island en masse and conduct a counter-landing against the United States after such a high proportion of Iran's navy has been destroyed or put out of commission. But Iranian forces are nothing if not creative, and they are highly motivated to accept risk to their own lives in order to deliver damage to an adversary. Everything from ordinary speedboats to fishing vessels to tugboats could be commandeered for improvised small unit attempts to land on the beach and harass US forces. Much more dangerous will be their artillery pieces. None of those weapons have enough of a range to hit Iran's Middle Eastern adversaries, but they all have the range to hit Karg Island, just off the Iranian coast. That's not to mention the possibility that Iran may be able to use shorter-range aerial drones, similar to the ones being used in Russia and Ukraine, potentially using fiber optic cables to get around jamming technology. Of course, there's a trade-off here that Iranian troops would have to consider. If Iranian forces can get their long-range artillery or their unconventional landing boats in range to threaten Karg Island, then America can see them, and America is going to try its very best to destroy them. Even still, those weapons can pose a very real threat to US forces once they've landed, and they're also going to come back and be even more relevant in a later phase of today's discussion. Then there are the munitions that Iran will be sending from further out, the one-way aerial attack drones and the cruise and ballistic missiles that it can launch from anywhere in Iranian territory. Again, it's not clear how much of these sorts of weaponry that Iran has left, but it is clear that Iran's got enough to pose a threat, even to targets much further away than Karg Island. Speaking of range, Iran possesses substantial stockpiles of shorter-range missiles and drones, weapons that can't be used to threaten Israel, the Gulf states, or US bases in the region. Here at Warfronts, we can't speak to the US or Israel's targeting policies, but we can take an educated guess and assume both nations have focused their attention on longer-range munitions and launchers that would pose a more immediate threat. But if Iran has, let's say, significant stockpiles of drones with a 100-kilometer radius, then those drones are going to be a massive problem for troops on Karg Island because they can be launched anywhere on Iranian soil or within a 100-kilometer radius. Those munitions will destroy the air defense systems, the fixed position radar, and the other critical equipment that the US will need to keep its forces on Karg Island safe. At short range, helps Iran in more ways than one. When targets are that close, it might only take a couple of minutes for weapons to be taken out of storage, prepared for launch, and fired, with only a couple of minutes more before they hit their target. That means they are harder for reconnaissance and surveillance to find and track, and they're easier to slip through air defenses, especially in the early phases where an American air defense shield over the island might not be complete. For the United States and Israel during this conflict, distance has mostly equated to safety from Iranian weapons, and even operating at this distance, their task has hardly been easy. Last week, the New York Times reported that several US military bases have already been severely damaged by Iranian drones and missiles, rendering some of those bases, especially in Kuwait, uninhabitable. Move US troops to a location as close to Iran as Karg Island, in a situation where those troops, their fighting vehicles and equipment, and their ships or aircraft have only a limited ability to get away or protect themselves, and they are sitting ducks. Now next up, what we want to do is discuss the challenges that the US will have to overcome before it's even in a position to deal with the problems that we've already discussed. But before we get there, we'd like to take a moment to discuss Fronts.co, which is our team's premium website, written news outlet, and one-stop shop for global conflict analysis. Over on Fronts, our team works with award-winning journalists and experts to provide key insights into the wars, flashpoints, and geopolitics that shape our world. Plus, we provide exclusive video episodes every single week, as well as our briefing on the Saturday collection of under-the-radar stories from across the globe. Also on Fronts, we provide multiple free offerings each week, including our twice-a-week newsletter on world conflicts, or Fronts Weekly, and our exclusive audio podcast, The Iran Daily Dispatch. Check out those free products, and if you want to subscribe, Fronts.co costs just $5 a month or $50 a year. Check out the site, subscribe if you like what you see. And now, back to Karg Island. The Outer Walls. So, Iran can harass and challenge the United States' attempts to take over Karg Island, and it can bombard, raid, and otherwise attack US troops once they're positioned on the island. But those two rings of defense, so to speak, are the rings that America will encounter only after its forces get to Karg Island. There's another ring of defenses that Washington would have to account for: the Strait of Hormuz, the other outlying islands across Iran, and the Iranian mainland itself. We're going to discuss America's force composition in its own chapter in just a few more minutes. But for now, suffice to say that we know what the United States is going to attack with. The US is deploying airborne assault units or paratroopers, it's deploying special operators and daredevil helicopter pilots. But the bulk of its attacking force is expected to comprise 2 Marine expeditionary units, each sailing into the region on amphibious assault ships. When they arrive, those US Marines will most likely be tasked with a beach landing. That's what they're trained for. It's what their ships are designed for, and it's a task that their fleet seems ready to accomplish. But in order to get those amphibious landing forces to Kharg Island, you've first got to get them through the Strait of Hormuz, which means that, under the current circumstances, you've got to fight your way through the Strait of Hormuz. If you can't, then those Marine units don't make it to Kharg Island, and the US is stuck with whatever forces they can drop, highly vulnerable and probably outnumbered from a fleet of tactical airlifters that Iran can target relatively easily, or worse, low-flying helicopters. For the purposes of today's episode, we aren't going to spend time on the disaster that a purely airborne operation would be, with troop numbers that are so limited that the problems we'll discuss later in this episode would be impossible to solve. Taking the Strait of Hormuz is a very difficult task in its own right, so difficult that as of now the US hasn't attempted to do it and has instead taken to berating members of NATO because they won't do it. The strait is only about 50 kilometers wide at its narrowest points, well within range of all those nasty weapons we've already talked about being fired from the Iranian mainland. Iran is known to have laid sea mines in the area already, and would very likely manage to lay more if it seems that the US is going to try to capture the waterway. Iran possesses over 1,000 small fast attack craft to harass ships trying to enter, and those fast boats are mostly concentrated near the strait, although it's not clear how many of those ships are still operable. To deal with all those problems at once, the US would need more naval vessels than it's currently got deployed in the Gulf of Oman, including dedicated minesweeper vessels that are mostly unavailable. And if the US really wanted to ensure that the strait was under control, it would have to capture at least some of the Iranian coastline, demanding a fair share of the ground forces at America's disposal. If you remember when a few minutes ago we referenced those many hundreds of thousands of Iranian ground forces that are itching to get into the fight, this is where they become extremely relevant. They can't reach Kharg Island once it's taken over, unless they're brave or stupid enough to try and do a beach landing from a fishing boat, but they can concentrate their power across coastal areas of the Iranian mainland. And if the US has to dedicate its naval power to securing the strait for long enough to allow an invasion of Kharg Island, then it can forget about escorting trade ships out of the Persian Gulf anytime soon. According to expert estimates, those crossings are so risky that the US and its allies could have to dedicate a warship, or maybe even 2 warships, for every tanker that's guided through. If the US wants to try and do it in convoys, then to move 10 tankers, the US needs a dozen warships. And that kind of naval power just is not available in the region right now. But let's say that the US does make that decision. It opens the Strait of Hormuz and secures the Iranian coastline long enough for these amphibious assault groups to slip through. And while we're at it, let's assume that the US manages to hold the strait, since capturing the strait and then letting it go again doesn't make very much strategic sense. Then those US ships need to get past Iran's other outlying islands in the Persian Gulf and avoid whatever munitions might have been hidden on those. Then, if the US wants to land troops on Kharg Island and keep them safe from all those artillery shells, rockets, missiles, drones, and raiders we were talking about before, then the United States can do that. But the way to accomplish that task quickly is by capturing even more coastline, this time by taking and holding a buffer zone around the shore nearest to Kharg Island. That raises the problem once again of the Iranian ground forces, this time in an economically critical, infrastructurally developed area where Iranian troops will be present in large numbers with the ability to navigate the landscape and maneuver quickly. And regardless of what the United States ultimately does or doesn't choose to capture, it's got to sustain its operations in every place where it decides to hold territory. And if it concedes territory after taking it, or decides not to capture all that territory after all, then it'll be a sign to Iranian forces that they can risk pressing their offensive further. After all, if the US can't hold the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nearby islands, Kharg Islands, and the coastlines near Kharg and near the strait, then Iran will have confirmed that America either can't stretch itself that far or isn't willing to try. The attacking force. At this point in the episode, We'd imagine that there's probably some portion of our viewing audience, hello, we appreciate you, thank you for watching, who's probably wondering why we're underrating the American military so badly. After all, while the US hasn't exactly shown itself to be a bunch of competent nation builders, American forces are extremely competent when on offense.
Honestly,
American air
I'm
power
not
is the
excited.
best in the world. American naval power is the best in the world. And anyone on Earth
That was
who's
terrible.
willing to go toe-to-toe with the Marines in an
Pitiable.
amphibious
Beat
environment
meat.
clearly doesn't know who the Marines are. But the limiting factor for the United States isn't competence. It's the number of troops at America's disposal to pull this off. When it comes to military occupations, size does matter, and the US ground forces currently en route to the Middle East just aren't numerous enough to take on an operation like this. There are enough troops inbound to seize Karg Island if Karg Island existed in a neat little vacuum, and there was nothing to fear from the outside world, but that simply isn't the case. And for the US to force its way through the Strait of Hormuz without actually capturing it, just to take Karg Island and pay no attention to the threats across the surrounding region would be incredibly risky. As we've mentioned, the bulk of the US force that's inbound to the region today is split between two Navy amphibious ready groups and the Marine expeditionary units traveling on board each. Those two groups of ships are carrying at least 3,000 Marines in total, and possibly closer to 5,000, along with the many thousands of Navy sailors required to operate the ships themselves. The first of those Marine expeditionary units will have already arrived in the region by the time this episode is released, although if you're seeing this episode at all, it's because those forces haven't attacked yet. The second group is expected to arrive sometime around April 8th, at which time the US will have to either tell them to sit tight or start to clear the way into the Persian Gulf. Also en route to the region is the
What?
82nd Airborne Division,
Really?
comprising around 1,500 paratroopers who trained rigorously for short-notice deployments on the expectation that they'll seize contested
How the
areas
hell am I
behind
supposed
enemy
to do
lines.
better than
The
that?
current members of the 82nd haven't
Well, everyone's
ever
gonna get
parachuted into a conflict in real-life conditions before. The unit last executed combat jump during the 1989 invasion of
rail
Panama.
stall.
They're very well practiced, but they're also light units, and so are the US Marines inbound to the region. That means they don't travel with tanks or large numbers of infantry fighting vehicles. According to some sources, the US is looking to deploy additional special operations units to the region, including Army Rangers, Naval Special Warfare Teams, and even the Delta Force, the uber-elite, ultra-competent raiders who most recently snatched Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro from his fortified bedroom. The US also may deploy its Night Stalkers, specialized and extraordinarily skilled helicopter pilots who specialize in extremely risky insertion and extraction operations. But in total, if we're being really optimistic about the numbers of troops that the US will deploy, that's only about 8,000 ground troops from several branches of the military, with several different specializations. All of them are very expensive, highly trained, high-value units representing immense investment of time and resources by the United States, not to mention immense numbers of lives put at risk. And while 8,000 troops is nothing to take lightly, that simply isn't enough to hold Karg Island, plus the nearby Iranian coastline, plus whatever else needs to be captured and how to maintain control over the Strait of Hormuz. 8,000 is more than enough to capture the island itself, but by capturing the island and nothing else, the US would be sending 8,000 highly valuable warfighters to squat on a very vulnerable exposed landmass. Send them to the Iranian coast on a mission that would ostensibly make Karg Island a safer place to occupy, and the amount of coastline those troops would need to capture and then defend from the sheer number of Iranian ground troops who could show up and oppose them is just too much. Nor are any of America's allies going to come and help. The nations of NATO have made it abundantly clear that they do not intend to put their own troops in harm's way for this war, and the same can be said for the nations of the Indo-Pacific. If the US could seize the Strait of Hormuz and hold it long enough for a NATO naval coalition to take over in a time of relatively reduced hostilities, then maybe those relief forces will allow US troops to move elsewhere. But now, we're talking about a timeline of weeks, if not months. Nor does Israel have any forces to spare. The nation is trying to invade and occupy southern Lebanon while continuing to occupy the majority of Gaza, while trying to keep order in the West Bank, while sustaining its air campaign against Iran, while defending the rest of Israeli-controlled territory against other threats that might emerge. The country doesn't have enough troops to sustain those operations, as its military leaders are openly admitting, and it certainly doesn't have excess of ground troops that could go and help out the Marines on Karg Island. The Gulf states might be a bit more willing, but to put it gently, they can't keep up, at least not in the high-paced multi-dimensional threat environments that an early occupying force would face. Not to mention those Gulf states will be busy dealing with the inevitable massive retaliation that Iran will target toward their energy infrastructure, their population centers, and maybe even their desalination plants. Even occupying Karg Island itself won't be as easy as it sounds. This is a place where thousands of people still live today, and while some among their number are a part of the Iranian military, most of them aren't. That means that if the US does seize Karg Island, it'll also have to keep control of a civilian population, requiring intensive round-the-clock guard and monitoring duties from the troops who have to remain there. With such a large civilian population, the US would also run the risk of Iranian fighters slipping into whatever internment camps the US would be creating, demanding even more troops for security screenings, rapid response capabilities, and possibly to replenish losses from ambushes and lone gunmen. That's yet another problem that can only be fixed by siphoning people away from that total pool of available troops. 8,000 on the ground, if we're being very generous. As we conclude this section, we should mention that most recently, as of the time of writing, the Wall Street Journal reports that Washington may send an additional 10,000 ground troops to the Middle East to assist in a Karg Island seizure or similar operation. Those troops would be supplied with heavy armored vehicles. That report was unconfirmed when this episode was written, although if those troops are inbound by the time you see this episode, then you'll be able to easily find record of that information through any number of news outlets. But while those 10,000 troops would go a long way in addressing the problems we've laid out, there are still two key concerns we've got to mention. First, an additional 10,000 troops may still not be enough if the US has to seize, occupy, and defend what would amount to a couple of hundred square kilometers of Iranian coastline between the areas near Karg Island and the areas near the Strait of Hormuz. That is a huge amount of land to hold, especially with hundreds of thousands of Iranian foot soldiers barreling down on their positions. Second, with a force that size, and with the limitations of the aerial and seaborne transport capabilities that the US has available, it's going to take several weeks at a minimum to get a force that size prepared, get them moved out to the Middle East, and to then deploy them into combat. It can be done, and 10,000 extra troops would help, but how much they'd help is hard to say for sure. The risks of overconfidence. As we come to the conclusion of today's episode, we trust that you see the quandary that the United States is walking into. But what our Warfronts team doesn't trust is that the US, and particularly the most gung-ho members of its political leadership, truly understand what they're signing up for. With this White House, there's always going to be a layer of machismo and tough talk over every conversation, but even taking that rhetorical slant into consideration, US leadership seems to have consistently underestimated Iran since before the start of the conflict. Worse yet, it doesn't seem as if the US is learning from those mistakes. Yes, Trump tried to shift into negotiations very quickly after Iran threatened to destroy the Gulf states' desalination plants, but otherwise, Trump and his administration appear to be caught up in the idea that they've already achieved victory. Yeah, if this conflict had a scoreboard, then it's true that the US and Israel's score would be vastly higher than Iran's. But this is a war, it's not a game, and for Iran, victory means survival. The scoreboard does not matter as long as the Islamic Republic still stands, and the Islamic Republic will still stand even if Karg Island were completely destroyed. By our estimation, no nation would choose to try and seize Karg Island in a ground invasion under these specific circumstances if they truly understood that reality. If we take this US administration at its word on the ways that Washington seems to understand this conflict and its role as a fighting force, then it seems that Trump and his allies believe they serve their interests with a ground invasion of Karg Island. They're operating on the assumption that their so-called final blow against Iran will force the regime to the negotiating table on terms favorable to the United States. They're under pressure from Israel to continue the conflict for as long as possible, and they're under pressure from the Gulf states to ensure that Iran's capabilities are so thoroughly degraded that they could never threaten the region in this way again. Despite what an overwhelming majority of US polls might say, despite the clear anxieties running through US markets, Trump and his inner circle seem to believe that those problems will go away if they can demonstrate enough strength and exert enough force to make Iran capitulate. Their logic is guided by a deep belief in American military might and an unimpeachable American strategic brilliance that during this conflict they treated as a fundamental expectation rather than a set of advantages that the US has deliberately maintained through constant, diligent effort for many decades. All in all, Washington's understanding its own incentives would seem to suggest that Washington believes a Karg invasion is worth trying. But no matter what Trump and his allies believe, an invasion of Karg Island is dictated by three core realities. Reality number one, capturing Karg Island is not the same as securing Karg Island as meaningful leverage over Tehran. To turn the island into leverage, the US has to capture and hold other targets that then place its Karg forces out of harm's way. Reality number two, the United States simply does not have the required force concentration either in the Middle East or on its way to the Middle East to be confident that it can capture and hold all the necessary targets at once. And Reality number 3, the United States cannot tolerate the deaths of large numbers of American troops in a war that the majority of Americans do not support and do not believe to be necessary. As of the time of writing, the US has acknowledged the deaths of 13 US service members, and already that's a major problem for the American public. Trying to capture Cargill Island plus multiple stretches of the Iranian coastline with 8,000 troops or even 18,000 is a recipe for those losses to increase tenfold at a minimum, and that's if the United States is extraordinarily lucky. The US cannot tolerate high troop losses without this war becoming politically untenable, and Iran knows it. Make no mistake, as soon as Iran has footage of American Marines and paratroopers dying grisly, horrific deaths on Iranian soil, that footage will be published as often as possible in as many places as possible, just to drive the costs of war home for the American people. None of the nations in this conflict have any intention of fighting fair, and when Iran plays dirty, that's what it's going to look like. Iran can accept high troop losses. It has no other choice but to accept high troop losses, and if the US invasion of Cargill Island is as poorly thought out and executed as it seems like it will be, then the United States is walking into a trap where Iran can bleed it dry and force Washington to capitulate. It's a grim assessment, so Warfront's team understands how hard it will be for some of our American viewers to hear, but it's the truth. War has changed too much, and Iran is too good at this particular style of warfare for an invasion of Cargill Island to go the way that Donald Trump thinks. Thank you for watching.
This is not going to go the way you think.
This is America, and America's military-industrial base is undergoing some serious challenges. Drones are redefining power. They're making conflict cheaper, and they are forcing the United States to rethink a lot of things. So what does this moment mean for the future of American dominance and military leadership? And who's adapting the fastest to this new type of war? I'll be back later in the program with more on that. But first, Anna Burns-Francis.
Thanks, Manny. America's in the business of making money, and when it comes to defence, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. In a moment, we'll be joined by our correspondent, Richard Gaisford, who's live for us at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The nation's capital is the epicentre of America's defence spending. Not only is it the home of federal funding, of course, it also plays host to the lobbyists and power brokers who drive the D.C. agenda when it comes to wartime spending, and with full support from the administration.
Our defense industrial base is more vibrant today than it's been since World War II. Contrast that with Iran, whose defense industrial base is nearly completely destroyed. Their ability to reconstitute the weapons of war they're using now that they're hiding in underground facilities and attriting over time, their ability to rebuild that is negligible. And I think that contrast is an enduring legacy of this as well.
A vibrant defence industrial base, that's one way to describe it. America has fought 5 major wars since 1945. Only the 1991 Gulf War was a clear success. But there was a clear winner in every case, the defence industry. During the Afghanistan war, stocks of the 5 largest defence contractors outperformed the S&P 500 by more than 50%. War is just politics by other means. But if the US is going to learn from its history of warfare, the lesson so far is that the conflict with Iran is going to cost a lot of money, and the losers won't be those making the weapons. Let's go now to our correspondent, Richard Gaisford, who's live for us at the Washington Mall in DC. Richard, paint us a picture, if you can, of the current spending on these big defence contractors as it stands at the moment.
Well, it's a significant contribution being made to the US economy by the defense industries. The last figures we have are for 2024, and that showed that they generated somewhere near $1 trillion. The US government puts about 10% of its annual federal budget into defense. That in turn helps support some 2 million jobs, most of them pretty highly skilled, highly paid. You can understand why, Anna, the senators and the congressmen and women are so desperately keen to keep these jobs in their regions. And these are the people that General Dan Kane was talking to today, and what really felt like a wartime message to evoke a wartime spirit.
Today I want to talk a little bit about a different front line, a line that doesn't have bunkers or guard posts, but is just as critical to our nation's security, our National Assembly lines. In every military option, we could not and cannot do our jobs without the men and women across our country who show up every day around the clock to a factory floor, a workshop, a laboratory, who build the weapons and capabilities we need to project American combat power at the time and place of our choosing.
Well, this is certainly an expensive war for the United States. In the first few days, it was estimated to be costing something like $900 million a day. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth's gone to Congress. It's asked for another $200 billion as a war fund. Says that might have to grow. That has certainly raised some eyebrows here. He today was talking about supplying the troops with more weaponry, had been on to a frontline base, had heard from a woman who'd asked him for more bombs, bigger bombs. Well, I've certainly seen those for myself at RAF Fairford in England. It's an American air base where they are operating B-1 and B-52 bombers that are running missions over Iran, and that is where we saw these big JDAM bunker-busting bombs being put onto the aircraft there. Supplies were being flown in daily. You could see them being taken across the airfield, across the runway, being put into those planes. And as we've heard today from Pete Hegseth and the general, this bombing will continue until Iran accepts a deal.
Richard Gaisford joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you. Well, the war in Iran has shown how the future of warfare has changed permanently. Thousands of low-cost drones have been launched toward Gulf countries, triggering their expensive air defense systems. And it's exposed an issue for the US military that experts have been warning about for years. Paddy Culhane explains from Washington, D.C.
As the war began, the videos started pouring onto social media. On the ground, witnesses documenting the future of warfare. Swarms of low-cost Iranian drones overwhelming expensive air defense systems, striking targets across the Gulf. Most intercepted, but not all of the estimated 1,300 one-way attack drones launched by Iran, most believed to be the Shahed. It can be launched from the back of a truck, costing between $20,000 to $50,000 to make. Countering these drones, fighter jets, and helicopters, but also ground-to-air defenses. The U.S., Israel, and the Gulf states mostly use two systems: Patriot missiles and the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, known as THAAD batteries, to knock down missiles and drones. But it's costly. The Patriot missiles cost around $4 million each, and two are supposed to be fired for each encounter. THAAD missiles, even more expensive than that. A single interceptor believed to cost around $13 million. But the admiral in charge of Central Command announced a new U.S. drone, which was also being used, dubbed Lucas.
This was an original Iranian drone design. We captured it, pulled the guts out, sent it back to America, put a little Made America on it, brought it back here, and we're shooting it at the Iranians.
But another Pentagon official put that into context a little later.
We're not in full rate production, so we ship what we had. We haven't produced tens of thousands of these, so they're in the dozens, but they've worked very well so far.
With these interceptors being used across the globe, they are in high demand, and the U.S. is trying to ramp up production. But right now, when it comes to the Patriot missiles, the U.S. expects to produce 600 to 650 this year. The missiles for THAAD, the Pentagon just announced a deal to bring production from 96 missiles to 400 this year. The government will not discuss how many missiles they've used in this war or the current stockpiles. But U.S. President Donald Trump has gone out of his way to say this isn't an issue.
Fortunately, we have a lot. We have a tremendous, unlimited supply of what you'd call middle and upper middle armaments.
That, as administration officials confirm, they may need to move missiles into the region from across the globe. Paddy Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
For years, US military dominance has been defined by technological superiority. But in this conflict, a new reality is taking shape, where low-cost drones are testing the limits of that advantage. Let's switch back to Manny Rapallo in the newsroom with a look at how that shift is being reflected across the media.
What we're seeing across the U.S. news media is growing recognition that in modern warfare, cheap drones can overwhelm billion-dollar systems, and the U.S. may have to rethink how it builds and buys weapons. Let's head over to Fox News. This is The Five giving us a good breakdown of just that.
Iranian Shahed drones pose a real threat to U.S. forces and our Gulf allies. So the Pentagon is now deploying new laser technology to help take them down.
Iran's biggest advantage is that these drones cost $35,000 to make, but one Patriot missile fired to shoot down these drones costs $4 million per missile. Now, these laser technologies cost pennies per shot, and perhaps they're part of the reason why the U.S. says it is not concerned about running out of munitions in this war.
Between low-cost drones and multi-million-dollar interceptors, it's clear the economics in this war are out of balance. And the U.S. defense industry isn't just responding, they're being forced to adapt. Let's head over to the Wall Street Journal with this headline: America downs cheap drones with multi-million-dollar missiles, but a fix is in the works. The article goes on to say that defense companies are racing to develop cheaper missiles. And the U.S. and other nations know they need to buy cheaper munitions and are looking outside the traditional defense industry to do so. Now, let's head over to CNN because their reporting suggests that the U.S. military is already moving in that direction. Take a listen.
The U.S. military has been very aware of the threat of drones. They've been training on these cheaper drones, getting defense industry to build more of them so that the U.S.'s arsenal had them as well.
Another way the U.S. has adapted is by copying Iranian drone technology. Forbes puts it this way: by reverse engineering Shahed drone, U.S. gives Iran a dose of its own medicine. The report goes on to say the development of the Lucas represents a remarkable turnaround. After all, for over 4 decades, it was post-revolutionary Iran that invariably copied American-made weapons and systems without Washington's consent. Now, together, this reporting points to another shift, that more expensive doesn't always mean more effective. This is Kelly Grieco on NBC News talking about Iran's strategy of wearing down the U.S. economically. Take a listen.
What it's trying to do is cause disruption. It's an indirect approach. It can't militarily defeat its adversary, but it can try to break its political will and make it exceedingly costly for a war to continue.
The war in Iran isn't just changing battlefield tactics, it is shifting the U.S. military defense industry itself. This is a conflict where cost is becoming a weapon. And as the United States continues to respond with some of the most expensive and advanced weapon systems in the world, another question is coming into frame. Not over who has the superior military, but who can afford to keep fighting.
Who can afford then to keep fighting? To answer that question and more, I'm joined in the studio now by Abbas Tahouk, a former senior military advisor for Middle East Affairs at the US State Department, and Kenneth Katzman, a former senior analyst on Iran at the US Congressional Research Service. Thank you both, gentlemen, for coming in. Kenneth, I'll start with you. Let's go straight to that question. Who has got the means to keep fighting at the current levels the longest?
Well, the United States the US dollar is the main reserve currency in the globe, which means the U.S. basically has the capability to manufacture money. Your viewers may not understand the mechanics of it, but basically the U.S. can print money. The United States is a $28 trillion economy. Iran is a $400 billion economy. So the issue, though, is the Iranian regime is able to take a lot of pain. They will eat grass if they have to survive. And the United States will not. Obviously, Mr. Trump did not go to Congress for approval. The American public has a certain tolerance for the economic impact, and so that is a limiting factor on what the U.S. can do.
It comes down to this perception, doesn't it, Abbas, about winning and who is winning and by what measure, because I'm wondering if the context has now completely changed about who is winning and how we measure that.
That's true. How do you measure effectiveness and how do you measure win? It's very difficult in this asymmetric environment. On the cost, it's true. The United States is a very rich country, and Iran is not. But Iran still was under sanctions for a long time and figured out how to fight at a low cost. And also has some shadow friends that could also feed them technology and perhaps some kind of capability. So the strategic shock here is this democratization of air power. Even a country like Iran, that their air force is basically totally destroyed and have no air capability, yet still able to project air power across international lines.
Can we pick up on that? Because there seems to have been an element of surprise, or at least misunderstanding perhaps of the situation. Kenneth, do you think it was a surprise to the US military that its opponent was armed with such a swathe of low-cost and destructive technology?
Well, no, I don't think it's a surprise. The issue is the U.S. went into this basically taking the issue of a ground offensive or ground troops off the table. It's come somewhat on the table. It's not completely on the table. And many experts would have said, if you're trying to change the regime or completely defeat Iran, you're going to need to have U.S. ground troops. So if you take that off the table, you're at a strategic disadvantage. And I think that's exactly what we're finding right now.
Yeah, I want to show our audience a graphic here comparing the cost of American defense systems to the price of an Iranian drone. And you can see the numbers are zeros and zeros and zeros out from each other. Abbas, at what point does the price of a drone, 20-odd thousand, versus the cost of having to defend it in the millions become unpalatable?
I mean, we're already seeing that at this point. It's the issue is not only money, also capacity to reproduce those very expensive, high-end air defense missiles and rockets. The drone, you can replicate a drone within probably weeks, but it takes months and years to, even though you have deep pockets, it takes years to replicate that. So it's the scalability and the cost together the main issue here.
That's a really interesting point that you said just there about replicating technology. We just had our reporter Patty Culhane produce a piece where she had a quote from Brad Cooper from the military saying they took an Iranian drone, captured it, ripped the guts out of it, he said, and stuck a little American sticker on it. And I'm wondering if there is some kind of hyperbole here that you have to get into a war to steal the technology to have the Kenneth.
Well, the United States has a lot of technological advantages.
Yeah,
I mean, Iran did invent a good drone. Actually, they shot down one of our drones many years ago and reverse engineered it. So they sort of stole from us. But let's not forget, the United States of America invented the airplane. A drone is an airplane, after all. It's an airframe. So I think the U.S. is not out technology here by Iran, but it takes a period of adjustment.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's top military brass, General Dan Kane, is adamant America's claimed success in Iran is thanks to that high-tech weaponry.
In just the first 13 days of this operation, our artillery forces have made history. They fired the first precision strike missiles ever used in combat, reaching deep into enemy territory. They've used Army ATACMS to sink multiple ships, including a submarine, and they've done all of this with the precision and determination that comes from relentless training and trust in each other and in their weapon systems.
Abbas, are America's expensive and high-precision systems the winning formula in this kind of combat arena or this kind of warfare?
I mean, at the end of the day, war is not won on the battlefield. They have to win around a negotiating table. No doubt the United States has superiority in all domains, air superiority and maritime superiority. And if there is a land invasion, perhaps they'll be victorious on the battlefield. But at the end of the day, it's the politics, what is the political end state, and how do you determine success, and you have to be around the table to declare victory or accept defeat.
We have seen, Kenneth, that there has been this asymmetrical warfare strategy from Iran, though, and that it has not been a one-and-done conflict over in 1 week. So will this, or the impact of Iran's strategy, shift the way or shift the needle for America's big defense contractors?
Well, it could, I mean, I think what it's going to shift is the belief in air power alone. And I think, the administration went into this believing it can achieve a strategic victory just with bombing. And I think that was a fundamental mistake. The only way to change the regime's calculations is with capturing Iranian territory. That will get their attention. Air power has not gotten their attention because the regime knows it's going to survive. No matter how much you bomb, they're going to survive in power. A ground offensive changes their calculation.
Can we go back to looking at the drones in particular? The Pentagon and politicians both seem to be aware that US tech has not kept up with that of its adversaries.
Drones are the most significant battlefield innovation in generations. This weapon system has altered the order of battle. Seeing this change several years ago, our adversaries today produce these systems by the millions at low cost. For too long, the United States was hindered by self-imposed restrictions and bureaucratic red tape, while our adversaries surged ahead.
The conversation on drones has come home to roost. You know, the Pentagon over many administrations, Democrat and Republican, has had this unbelievably glacially slow process of acquisition. And now I feel like, unfortunately, we're paying the price for that.
Abbas, if that sort of knowledge has reached public hearings, or that level of concern has reached public hearings, would that suggest that military bosses perhaps also share those concerns?
I mean, definitely. There are, we just mentioned earlier that the United States also replicating the Iranian drones and Iranian tactics, techniques, and procedures. We're also replicating what the Ukrainians are doing. I mean, now the Ukrainians are helping the United States and helping the GCC countries to counter the Iranian drones. So those and those lessons learned, even though from the enemy, you have to be wise enough to also accept them yourself if you want to survive or on the battlefield.
Kenneth, a lot has been made publicly in American media, as we saw, about the level of America's defence spending. And I saw it was, I think, nearly $1 trillion has been allocated for spending already this year. That is more than the GDP of Ireland, Argentina, and Singapore. Is this a good return on investment for America or Americans?
Well, you know, it's catching up after some slow period. You know, the issue, many would say it's not the issue of drones, it's ships. We're not building enough ships. That's an issue. China's building, I think, 10 to 1. For every one warship we build, they build 10. So I think there are questions about how it's been allocated. Drones, I think, is perhaps over. I mean, we've helped the Ukrainians develop their drone warfare, and now they're helping us. So I think I don't think we're as far behind on drones as the Congresswoman, the senator, was making out in that hearing.
Abbas, though, if we look at just the spending alone and the amount of money that the American military has and spends every year. There's, I think, a phrase you'll probably both be familiar with, the American war machine, right? This concept that the economy is largely driven by, and I know relative to things like healthcare, it's far insignificant, but there is this concept that it is cyclical, that it is being driven and pushed for profit by a group of companies and lobbyists and senators that profit from this, and that it keeps going. Do you have any, is that a reasonable or accurate assessment in any way?
I mean, there is some of that, but also remember, look at it's $1 trillion, you're saying, but this is about less than 10% of the U.S. Budget. So it's not a lot of money when you look at the U.S. Budget itself. And also I'm the product of the military, so we do a lot of training. We spend a lot of money. I mean, the United States, the hallmark of U.S. military is training. And that's very expensive, but not as expensive as B-2 bombers and the bunker buster munitions. But there's an expense in there, and I think could they cut down some of that? I'm sure, but it's if you want to maintain military like what you see out there, you have to put some money next to it.
What is the purpose of maintaining that military, though, when there will be critics out here, and perhaps I'm playing devil's advocate here, that this was a military offensive despite any assessment of a threat or not? There were diplomatic talks underway. Do you need that much military might and money going if you are the aggressor in the war, and we have seen this in other administrations as well, rather than defend? This is not about defending American coastline.
That's true, but it's about defending American interest as the current administration identifies it.